everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, June 19th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to take a moment to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that is because I rely on the support of individuals just like you to keep this show going. This week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right, so let's dive into this week's episode. I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Erin Kimmerle. She's a forensic anthropologist, and she wrote a new book called We Carry Their Bones, The Search for Justice at the Dozier School for Boys. So this is all about her work doing these forensic investigations at this grounds where a school was held for many, many years, where some pretty unthinkable acts took place. There was quite a bit of cover-up, quite a bit of difficulty getting to the truth, and her scientific investigations really helped shed some light on some missing people, some of these cold case challenges. And so she tells the story better than I do. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Erin Kimmerle. Well, Erin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm excited to talk about your new book, We Carry Their Bones, The Search for Justice at the Dozier School for Boys. Is that how it's pronounced? Dozier? Dozier?
That's correct.
Dozier.
Yes, Dozier.
Okay. Gotcha. And so I think before we get into this really important story that hopefully you're going to be able to share some of the, I guess, the structure of the story with us, kind of the background that we're going to need. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about kind of yourself and how it came to be that you wanted to tell this story in a full-length book. So you are an anthropologist, yes?
I am, yes. Anthropologist. I focus and specialize in forensic anthropology. I've been doing it for just over 20 years now, and really love my job and love this work.
And so when we think of forensic anthropology, it's probably a little bit of a misunderstanding, but I think a lot of people may not know the difference between anthropology, forensic anthropology, archaeology. Like we might think ancient.
Right. Yeah. And, we're partly responsible for that. I say we as anthropologists because it's such a broad field, and we train our students, and we receive training in all different aspects of anthropology. So we're all pretty broadly trained, at least in this holistic way. And then you specialize and focus more and more. So forensic anthropology is really about taking the methods, the tools that we use in sometimes archaeology and sometimes biological anthropology, what we know about the human skeleton, and applying it to medical legal cases. So it's these cases or situations where, skeletons or decomposing remains are found. We don't know who this person is. We need to figure out their identity. What happened to them, what injuries, what's the cause of death. And so we use all kinds of different methods from biological anthropology in these medical legal investigations.
So very often we're talking about, contemporary, like we're talking about modern, like right now cases.
That's right. Correct. Yeah. Medical examiners or the police will call anthropologists to assist on cases, and they're typically homicide investigations or other, current death investigations.
And sort of as an academic anthropologist, I'm curious how much of your time is spent doing applied forensic anthropology, and how much of your time is spent, I guess, kind of like researching the methodology?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm more and more, most of my time is spent doing this applied work. Even when I teach now, a lot of the courses I teach for graduate students are very hands-on, often involve community engaged projects or in-service learning projects. So it feels like service is interwoven into not just the research, but also the teaching. And the questions that I look at for research really come from the sort of problems that we face in the casework. So it's questions or puzzles or unknown things that come up in casework that really drives the research questions that then I and my students dig into.
Yeah. And, before we get into the specifics of the Dozier School, I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question eloquently. So bear with me if my question is a bit meandering. But I can imagine that there's a bit of a push and a pull that individuals in your position find themselves in when you are investigating a failure, a social justice failure, a failure of humanity, a crime, abuse, just a human problem. And your decision making, it's like, how much of this is that sort of cold, dispassionate, I'm going to let the evidence guide me, I'm going to look specifically at the science, and I'm not going to have any thoughts or feelings about the situation, and how much of it is a kind of quest for justice and a drive towards kind of maybe righting some historical wrongs?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think you're spot on in that there is often this give and take. I think describing it really as as a process, and that those different components come through. Each aspect of the process is really the right way to sort of explain it. I mean, I can do this job and be very focused in on the evidence and be very sort of objective and distant. The facts are what they are, and that's always the most sort of important critical piece, right? Is that objectivity. Therefore, being able to defend your conclusions in court if it's a criminal case, and that's important. But I, like anyone in this field, is we're still human, and a lot of times when we're doing these cases that involve a historic justice issue, or if it's international and it's a human rights issue, the bigger picture, and the bigger scope of what we're doing and trying to accomplish is always there. And often in those situations, there's just a lot of like bureaucracy or politics or just public opinion, different stakeholders. And so there's often a lot to navigate in terms of being able to do the work, basically. So it's not just like you get brought in and you're this scientist and you do your work in the lab and you're done. It's more often working with communities, families, victims, law enforcement, prosecutors, all these different stakeholders and people with their own sort of perspectives or interests, and being able to navigate that.
And so, I mean, I guess that kind of takes us to the topic at hand, which is the Dozier School for Boys. Maybe you can give us a little bit of background for those listening to the show who have never heard of the Dozier School.
Sure. The Dozier School was a reformatory. It was a school / juvenile detention center that opened in January of 1900. And at the time, Florida really didn't have prisons. It had a convict lease system, and children who were convicted of crimes were also placed into that convict lease system, which basically meant labor bosses took control of the prisoners or wards for a length of time, and they did hard labor, manual labor of some type, until their sentence was served. And so this reform school idea was, hey, let's get children out of this leasing program and give them education and job skills so they can return to society as productive members. And it quickly, grew into one of the largest reform schools in the country. By the 1950s, it had over 1,000 boys incarcerated at a time, and they actually had to build a second facility to house everyone. And the school slash detention facility actually closed in 2011. So it closed very recently, and it was under a lot of different types of investigations when it finally closed.
So, I mean, it sounds like at the turn of the century that the intention of I guess, school, I'm putting school in quotes because it's so much more than a school, but the intention of a reform residential facility was coming from a sort of good place. Like, these are kids who are getting into a lot of trouble, and we want to help them develop life skills, and we want to help them develop psychological skills to I don't know, better be able to face a future. Is that what it was in practice?
I would say that's what it was in theory. It really wasn't what it was in practice. And it was at a time when you see that sort of idea, right? Like the notion across the country because at the time, there's different types of indentured servitude, convict lease, poorhouses, Indian residential schools. And so it's kind of a national movement at the time to offer these reform schools. So it was just in keeping with that practice, I think.
Right. And I think that's always so important. Not that it excuses anything away, but the context of the time and understanding what the alternatives were and like what the pressures were and kind of what was available to individuals and the decision-making capacity that they had is important for telling a story like this. We can't look at it in a vacuum. It happened in context.
Exactly. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about how you first came across this and how you became interested in the story.
Yeah, like a lot of people, I think, at least in Florida and in Tampa, it was in about 2010, 2011, I was reading in the newspaper, the local paper, one story after another about the investigations that were going on with this school. And at the time, it was still open. And I met the investigative reporter, Ben Montgomery, who was doing a lot of that investigative work, and then went to a book reading. There had been a man by the name of Robert Straley who had been sent there in 1961 when he was 12 years old and had come, forward really in about 2005, started finding other men online who had similar experiences with physical and sexual abuse. And they formed a group called the White House Boys. And so he had written a book about his experience and was talking about it at a local bookshop in Tampa. And so I had the opportunity to meet him and Ben and just really got engaged with the story. It was very compelling. Meeting Robert, I think, was, he was this man in his late 60s and had never really talked about this before coming forward, and had this sincerity about him, and some of the work that Ben and the St. Petersburg Times were doing was also talking to families whose brothers and uncles had been sent to the reform school and who died and never came home, and that of course caught my attention. And those families just reminded me a lot of other families that we've worked with when it comes to missing persons and cold case investigations. And so it was apparent that, anthropology offers so many, methods and tools to help in a situation like this. And that's really the kind of work we do every day, even though it might be, not a reform school, might be a cold case, but it's the same type of work. And I might be jumping ahead a little bit here, but the state had done an investigation after Robert and other men came forward. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, which is the top law enforcement agency in Florida, And they said, hey, nothing bad ever happened here. All the deaths are accounted for. There's really, case closed. There's nothing here. And that was in contrast to the families and everybody else who was coming forward.
Right. So you mentioned, and this was, I think, an important question that I wanted to ask. As an anthropologist, you're able to sort of bring to the table some of these different tools and perspectives to help, I guess, explicate this, or maybe to help. What's the word I'm looking for? Find the truth in between these different accounts that are wildly different, right? You've got these individuals who are older adults now, who were children at the time, saying, listen, this is what I saw, this is what I felt, this is what I heard. And then you've got these agencies that are saying, nope, nothing to see here. Don't believe them because there's no wrongdoing. And so what are these, I guess, tools? What are these approaches that you can go in with and start, I guess, elucidating the situation?
Right. Yeah. And so that's exactly what happened. And, I'd say from the perspective of the modern law enforcement agencies, like from FDLE's perspective, I think because they're always mandated to look at things through this lens of a criminal investigation, that is really what sort of binds them, right, or restricts them. So if the statute of limitations has run out, which is the case, if the bad guys are dead, which is the case, then these doors shut, right, because we can't pursue criminal charges against somebody who's deceased, or if the statute of limitations have run out. And so these were some of the obstacles. And I think what anthropology can offer, and what we were able to sort of demonstrate and bring to the table, is that, this just like on the more, conceptual side is, hey, justice can come in different forms, right? We are not bound only to criminal investigations. We do things internationally called humanitarian investigations. And that's when we're really focused on what are the rights of victims and rights of families. And sometimes it's just the right to know what happened. It's knowledge, and that maybe knowledge is a form of justice. And so by keeping that door open and saying, okay, well, let's uncover everything we can, like let's investigate it as rigorously as we would if it were a criminal investigation, but the outcome is not going to be a trial. The outcome is going to be, information, or, maybe repatriation of human remains, or whatever the next goal is.
Yeah. And so in the case of the Dozier school, what were some of the things that were being said? What were some of the narratives that you were first hearing that made you interested? What were some of these guys saying happened?
So there's a few things that sort of immediately caught my attention. One is this idea that there were only 31 deaths and burials. There were 31 crosses that had been put in a field in the 1980s because the school had come across human remains when they were planting trees, basically. And then it was like staff said, oh yeah, that's right, there had been burials here. And they wanted to acknowledge or memorialize in some way this burial ground. And so they looked through the records and said, okay, only 31 died, and they put up 31 crosses. And that's what the state kind of clung to when it later did its investigation in 2008, saying, see, everyone's accounted for. I mean, having done so much work in historic cemeteries and even in our cold case investigations where we're trying to excavate John Doe graves from the 1980s, I can tell you every cemetery has mysteries and problems and issues. And so knowing that these graves had never been marked or documented, that's right there a red flag. But then there's the question of why not? I mean, this was a state-run school. The director and the board of managers answered directly to the governor throughout its history. And why were the deaths not documented, not reported back to the state. And then when we heard from families is that they were denied access, even at the time of the deaths. They were denied the remains back. And so that's also, a cause for concern. And under Florida statute, they have rights, to those remains and to access the graves. So these are things that I thought we could help with, maybe provide clarity and a way for families to at least visit the graves. That was initially what we thought would happen.
And so, we're talking about a school that you said it was running from what, like the 1900 through 2011. Is that right?
Right. That's right.
111 years. And number one, what I'm hearing from you is that number even accurate, that 31 or 32? Is that an accurate number? Did you say 31 or 32?
There was 31 crosses.
31, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So number one, is that even an accurate number, which I think obviously we're going to get to. But even beyond that, let's say there were only, quote unquote, only 31 deaths. Is that not a lot of deaths at a school? Like, shouldn't there be no deaths? This is the part I'm kind of confused about. And did the families know what happened to their children?
Well, and they really didn't. And that's what they were saying, when they were coming forward and under Ben's investigations. But then the more we dug into the history and talked to more families and tracked them down, I mean, they were really not given information even at the time. So, the family would basically get a letter in some cases, stating that their son had died and was buried on the school grounds, and had very little information about what really happened to them. In one case, Thomas Varnado had died there, and the family was notified, and they said, well, he was very sickly, because he'd only been there about a month, which was actually, we found common that children died quite often within the first few months. But he'd only been there about a month, and they said, oh, he came here, he was very sickly, and he died of the flu. But the family said, well, he was never sick. I mean, he wasn't sick when he went there. And that's I think, an important point, too, is that, a lot of the reports that came out and what the state said, even in modern times, is, look, kids, they died of the flu. Some of them died in a fire when the dormitory caught on fire. Kind of like these are natural or very explainable events. And I thought, that there's truth in that, of course, right? I mean, especially 1918, there was, the flu was worldwide pandemic. I mean, so yes, but when you start looking at the details, right? We started looking at like all the legislative reports because this was state run. They would do annual reports, and the school had to report to the state, and the legislature would send investigators to do investigations. And when you start looking at the details, you see that, during that flu epidemic, the boys on the black side of campus, which was segregated at the time, were abandoned by administrators. And days later, the state doctor came through and found boys, sick, naked, without food, and he wrote, the dead are piling up. The same thing with like the fire. You start looking at this dormitory fire, and you see that the boys that died in it were chained to their beds on the third floor in isolation cells and were therefore not able to get out of the building. And at the time, it was very controversial. There were 3 different investigations. Each one listed a different number of boys that died. So my point, when we started to find this and what I told state leaders is that there's still an accountability and a culpability with the state. I mean, these kids were in state care. And so it's not as simple as, explaining, deaths by flu and things like that.
Right. And so even, I guess, before we get into the how of it all, just the what of it all, the quantity, it had to be uncovered. And so I'm just curious, like, what are the steps that, as forensic anthropologists, what are the steps that are taken to try and get to the truth?
Yeah, so it was research, a lot of different types of research, if you will, in stages and kind of multi-layered. So there's archival research going through all these historic records, as many as possible, newspaper accounts, legislative reports, death certificates, cross-validating. Right, that's how you have to do historical research to try and find accuracy or consistency. There was talking to former staff and men who had been there as boys, and the families that we could track down. So a lot of the boys that died, we still had siblings alive. Many of them were in their 70s and 80s, but they remember what happened. Some of them had documents from the school that had been sent to their parents. So there's a lot of sort of archival research, ethnographic, we call it, doing the interviews and talking to the people who are there, and then field work. And that's, starts out with a lot of historic maps and GIS analysis, because the other thing I didn't mention, but the school had been 1,400 acres. And so that's a big school. And honestly, that's one of the first things that caught my attention, because I thought, in 1900, how many children are in custody that you need 1,400 acres to house them, And so what else is going on, right? Why would you need such a huge property? Because the community, the town, donated the land, and they were competing against other towns to get this reform school in their community.
Okay. Right. So there's an income kind of generation that to be had there. Yeah.
Exactly. So you start to kind of follow the money, and then the story sort of unravels in another way.
Okay. And so you're looking both at forensic kind of forensic money trails. You're looking at all sorts of different forensic documents. You're also gathering first person and second person accounts, and then you're also physically starting to look for the actual evidence. I mean, this is a huge undertaking.
Yeah, it was, and we started really in 2012. That's I think it was right. It was like November, December of 2011. I wrote for permission to access the property. And I remember, because we just finished the semester, I was getting ready for like the holiday break, and I think got the letter back. So we started right at the beginning of 2012 and didn't present our final report until 2016.
Okay, yeah, so that's quite a bit of work. And so I guess I don't know, what do you think? I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking, okay, we're maybe at like the halfway point. Do we start talking about your findings? Is there anything that you think we should make sure is clear before we start talking about what you ultimately kind of put in your report?
Well, I mean, I guess I would say, I would just clarify this a little bit, is that when I first started the project, I had asked they call it like an internal grant. Basically, it's a small amount of money, through the university, just to go up there and do, I thought, 2 weeks of field work. Okay. And it was, the first question was, because the property was still owned by the state, can we have access? And so they said yes. And so I'm just saying, it started out in this sort of, well, let's just go up there and see what we find, right? Like, what can we even see? And it's just really, the more we dug and the more we went up there and did anything, we just found more and more. And so quickly it was like, okay, this is going to be a lot bigger. And the initial field work that we did, we estimated 50 burials. And so right there, that's, 19 more than what the state said. And we made those reports, or we made kind of a preliminary report available, mainly because the families, the White House boys, there were so many interested parties and people, and we just wanted to be real transparent. And part of that, I think, was important too, to let people know, look, we're not doing this, because we're hired by one group or one side or another. This is just, as sort of a scientific research endeavor in and of itself, and whatever we find is what we find. Maybe we find nothing. I don't know till we try. And so So in that way, we tried to just be really transparent and let people know sort of as it unfolded.
In this kind of first endeavor, this first pass, you said that the number immediately went from 31, which was the sort of party line, the accepted number from the state, up in over 50. That's not a clerical error. So I can imagine that a discrepancy like that has to induce a question of, well, if it's already that much more, could there be even more?
Right. Exactly. And that's what happened. And so you have kind of the different groups of people and their different interests sort of start staking in then, right? So those who are in the community who were sort of opposed to this work, and the more we did, the more they opposed the effort, just clung to that. Well, you're doing it wrong, or those aren't burials. What you're estimating, it's buried trash, or it's buried mules, or they come up with sort of different explanations for what it might be. And likewise on the other side, the White House boys and some of them, and others, said, well, it could be hundreds, right? We don't know. There's so much unaccounted for in the terms of the history of this institution.
Were you able to actually remove the remains and study the remains themselves?
Ultimately, we were. Yeah, that became about a 9-month challenge in itself. So what happened after we released our initial findings is the families of some of those boys, direct siblings and nephews and nieces, said, okay, we want the remains back. Because at the same time, right before we started our fieldwork, the school closed and the state was getting ready to sell the land. And they were going to sell it to different developers, basically to do different construction and development projects. And so the families were very afraid that, look, we don't know where where our relatives are buried. We don't know what happened to them. We don't think it's anything, good. They thought it was quite nefarious. And so they filed an injunction saying that the state couldn't sell the property until they could show them where their remains were. And so we asked the state if we could exhume the burials that we found, try to identify them, and hopefully we'd be able to return them then to these families who were asking. And every sort of way in which you would normally do an exhumation, through the courts, through law enforcement, through the Division of Historical Resources, all those doors were shut to us. And this is where it became, this sort of, well, it's not a modern criminal investigation, so therefore local law enforcement said, we don't want to have anything to do with it. It's not an archaeological project for research, so the Division of Historical Resources said, oh, you can't, exhume a cemetery. Mind you, any given day in Florida, there's graves being moved somewhere for development. That's, if you come across it, oh, gee, I didn't know this was here, you can move the burials. But because we found what we thought were burials, it was like all these doors shut. And, I think that's where you just see you see that in a lot of other examples of these historic justice process projects, because there's different sort of systems, but like none of them fit exactly this historic narrative. So and I always, every time we talked about this, everyone we talked to, I said, look, we're shutting these doors, but that's just policy. That's just our choice. We could easily open these doors, as well as shut them.
Right.
And so that became a pretty, intense public battle for about 9 months.
Well, it must be such a difficult, and I know this is the human condition, and there is this deep attempt at objectivity and at sort of like maintaining this, I don't know, innocent until proven guilty stance. But there is this very human place that your mind goes when it's like, if you're not trying to hide something, why not be transparent? And I can imagine the grappling with that. Like, we need to excavate and excavate and excavate until we have the closest approximation that we have to the truth, and constantly fighting along the way the feeling of, what are you hiding from me?
Right. Yeah. And I feel like, we spent a lot of time trying to make it easy for everyone to say yes. Like, it was like, we want a yes because we're going to make it so easy that it's, the easiest choice for you. And yet there was a lot of resistance, much more local resistance than I, could have anticipated. And that became a pretty strong, sort of political voice that, then turned into state politics and pressure back to the university. And it's, I think that we were able to push through it and do it in large part because we were researchers at a university and have academic freedom. I mean, that's really what it means. And anyone else, and over the years, people tried to reform, make reforms at the school. They tried to get the physical abuse, the corporal punishment to stop. It always failed in the end. And I think that's because it's coming from, advocates and people who are trying, but they're trying within these government systems where there's no protection if you go against the current. And so I think coming through a university opened that door.
It's interesting because, and maybe this was not a part of your analysis, and maybe this is me asking you to give me a subjective opinion that maybe you're comfortable and maybe you're not comfortable sharing. But I'm always curious in these situations, before we kind of get to the big reveal, about the why of it all. And I think it's very obvious that like administrators of an actual school would have something to hide or would want to cover up any sort of malfeasance or wrongdoing or even just neglect, really, in an effort to keep the doors open, in an effort to keep the funding coming, in an effort to just maintain the status quo. But why so much resistance and pushback from other, what groups did you find that there was a lot of resistance and pushback from? And do you know what their motivations were?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that, a lot of it, because, there were, I would say this, in the local community, there were people who were very supportive. And yet, obviously, the real opposition to this whole effort was in that local community. It wasn't people in Miami or Tampa or something, concerned about what was happening up in, Mariana, which is just about an hour from Tallahassee. So it was definitely in the local community, and it had been the traditional sort of power structure, the Board of County Commissioners and the Economic Development Board and the local police chief. And I think there was a few things at play. Part of it was they saw this as an obstacle to the land development they were pushing for. Part of it was, I think, looking back, was, sort of a cultural war, if you will, because they would say things like, you're hurting our economy. You're making us look bad. You're doing this for the wrong reasons, publicity or something. They would, just kind of come back to how basically this was economically depriving them of something. And so I think part of that's, at the same time, they're lobbying to get the land given back to them to develop it. So I think there's that. A lot of the people who were in this opposition, their fathers, grandfathers, uncles for generations worked at this school. And so they saw it as an affront to them, to kind of, uphold this reputation, if you will. Nothing bad ever happened here. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with race, because just very disproportionately, the boys who died there or buried there were Black. And that whole convict lease system comes out of, sort of a post-slavery era to get free labor. And the racial tension has followed after the Civil War there through today. They still have a lot of problems with that. The NAACP had been very supportive of our work and kind of took on that, we'll be a voice for those who don't have, a name and a face and a voice right now. And so I think that definitely played into it.
Right, I can imagine. And so, maybe here in sort of the last third of the show, one of the things that we can do, or that you can do, is to be a little bit of that voice for now, as we know, the voiceless, and share some of the stories, or share, and as tragic as they may be and as hard as they may be to hear, kind of enlighten us as to the truth that was, like metaphorically and also literally buried for so long.
Yeah. One of the stories that, I can share, for example, and it's interesting to me too, is that because it kind of hit me late in our work in terms of, I certainly know and knew throughout this the impact, that it has on people and the families we were working with. But there was one boy, Earl Wilson, who had been sent to the school when he was about 12 years old. And a lot of the things that the boys were sent to, especially in those early years and decades, was trespassing, skipping school, truancy, riding in a stolen car, theft, incorrigibility. I'm just to kind of paint a picture that it wasn't, like we think of, maximum security offenders today or something.
Right. Like it's like misdemeanor. This is like delinquency
right.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And we did find a real, disproportionate sort of number of, way in which the law was applied. Like the non-criminal offenses, like incorrigibility, right? You see that much more common for Black boys than white boys. You see these sort of racial disparities throughout, and the school lobbied really hard in the early years to take the power of parole and the length of sentence away from the courts, away from the judge, to their board of directors. And they said explicitly, hey, we don't have enough labor to bring in the crops. We're doing all this farming to sustain the school, and we can't bring in the corn. So we need longer sentences. And so, and I thought that was actually just very interesting and revealing when you just look at sort of, I'm by no means a legal scholar or, legal historian or anything like that. But, you look at like these laws and how they developed, and it's like, wow, you see this lobby effort to incarcerate more children, incarcerate them for longer periods of time for non-criminal things, to meet these labor needs. And of course, we know, the effect today that what that's grown into. So that was, I think, very, revealing for me and for us. But going back to Earl Wilson, he's sent there when he's 12, something like riding in a stolen car. And he ends up in a situation where he sees two boys kind of skipping out on the work duty they were supposed to do, and they were smoking. And he's asked about it, and he says, yeah, they were smoking when asked. And so he, along with them, are all sent to the White House. The White House was a building where they administered corporal punishment, and that was whipping. And it didn't matter if you were Black or white; everyone went there for a whipping, or what they called spanking, but it was a whipping.
I see. So these were the White House boys, were the boys that were basically beat in this area.
Exactly, in that building. And then they would get sent to isolation. Then if you were white or Black, you were segregated on two different campuses that were divided by a road. And so Earl Wilson, who was Black, was sent back to that side of the premises, and that's where the farm was located. And they had this small building they called the farm manager's office. But during this time, and this was in the 30s and 40s, it was used as a sweatbox. And it was a tiny little building, basically 6 by 10 feet. So like smaller than a dorm room, and they had 9 boys staying in there. They had a bucket for a toilet and a bucket of clean water. And so when I went there, read the transcripts from about what happened to Earl and walked in this building, I think, how did any of them survive, right? Not just like how did Earl end up dead, but how did any of them survive these conditions? And Earl ended up murdered, but of course, what happened to him was open for question, and I think to some extent still is today. The family was told by a boy that went there and that knew him that a guard had killed him while he was in this sweatbox. At the time, the other 8 boys kind of pointed fingers at one another. 4 of them were ultimately convicted, the youngest one being 12. They all spent the rest of their lives in prison, never got out. What's interesting, too, about that case is that the 4 boys who were not convicted, they testified, they said that he had been choked to death. The school's physician that served as kind of like a medical examiner, he wasn't officially that, but he did the autopsy and testified, said that he died from blunt injuries. Basically, he'd been beaten. Do you think about that today? Like in a court case, if your leading eyewitnesses and your medical examiner's cause of death don't match, you would have a problem,
Right. And you would want to look at the physical evidence.
Right. Yeah. And in this case, the testimony of the doctor was that, he didn't have any, signs of bruising or hemorrhage or anything in the neck that would suggest being strangled. So there's problems with the case then and now. Earl was ultimately buried at the school in an unmarked grave. The family was notified. I met his sister through this work. I always ask them, the families, about what they recall about their parents' initial reaction, in the sense of what did they say and what did they sort of do in terms of corresponding or going to the school. And she said, and so many of them said, it just killed my mother. Her mother died a short while later of a heart attack, I believe. And she says died of a broken heart. They were never, went to the trial. They were never given any information about it. She didn't know. And this is where I say it kind of really struck me. Once we identified Earl, right? I'm jumping ahead, but we find his grave, we identify him, and the family knew, and we invited them to do a public release of information about it, and going over the details, and just watching, Cherry's reaction in the audience, and it just, it's profoundly sad, and thinking, why, after all these years, decades later, they're having to sort of relive this, and we're never properly given this information or his remains or anything back.
So what did you find when how did you identify amongst all of this, all of these acres and all of this evidence? How did you identify this one particular boy? And then 2, what did his remains tell you?
Yeah, so we ended up getting permission. So I told you all those doors closed for permission to excavate. What we ended up doing was going directly to the Florida cabinet as the landowner, right? As a landowner, if there's graves on your property, you have a right to have them removed. And that was the approach. It was kind of like a workaround approach we took, saying, hey, state of Florida, there's these graves on your property. Do you want us to move them? And the cabinet agreed and gave us permission. So it was a complete workaround from all the systems that normally exist. And with that, we set out to excavate all the barrels we had estimated were there through doing, ground penetrating radar and all of our field, archaeological field work. We ended up finding 55 graves. We had underestimated. In part, that's because those additional graves were under a tree, under fence posts, things that we were not, structures that we were not able to initially look under when we did our field work. And what we had to do is basically exhume everyone, look at the remains, come up with age at death, and if there was anything about injuries or health that we can, whatever we can learn about a person from their skeleton. And then we did DNA testing, and we were able to identify individuals that way. And so Cherry, his sister, had given us a DNA sample, and that's how we were able to find Earl.
And then when you found Earl, what kinds of stories did his bones tell you?
Well, I mean, we were able to, like I said, really confirm his age, and in the preservation of the remains were good enough for DNA. Fortunately, we were able to get DNA in most of the cases. It was not good enough to preserve for trauma or injuries if it had been there, but to really look at the surfaces, the remains were more degraded than that. So unfortunately, when we did this work, that one, big question that we all had was sort of left unanswered, other than whatever the historical records and documents could tell us. So we were able to, gain a lot of information that way to share with his family, but we were also limited due to preservation and what was there.
Were there any indications, maybe outside of Earl, but amongst these other, 54 boys, was there any indication of, or was there any discovery of any evidence that was contradicting sort of what you had been told, what most of the community had been led to believe? Like, were there any big, I guess, epiphany moments?
I think that, I think the number of remains themselves, I think that, several of, I think two of the boys were quite young, 5 and 6 years old. One boy had a polio brace on his knee. So, it kind of starts to paint this picture of, who are these convicts, if you will, that are buried here, and what's their condition. And to me, it unfolded like this, like one example after another of why we need civil rights, and why we did and do, and why they're so fragile. Because this is a time all this happens. Like, you could be so young as a child, you were not given a lawyer, your family wasn't notified. You could be sick, have different physical or mental disabilities. Didn't matter. You were sent to these sort of reform school, correctional facility, the same, and there was just no protection, right, for people that we have today, or hope, strive to have today. So that was, I think, sort of a aha moment for me. A lot of the remains did show chronic infection, so that maybe wasn't the cause of death, but it's shows you sort of their state of health. Lots of untreated caries, abscesses, dental problems, just poor health, smaller than they should have been, in terms of stature for their age. I think
so. You saw neglect in their bones. You saw that these kids were probably underfed and undertreated.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
And I mean, this is obviously, I'm not asking for a specific number or anything, because you did the work on the Dozier School for Boys, but this is not an isolated event, is it?
And I think that what probably you'll start to hear more and more about in the future actually are the Indian residential schools, because they're very analogous, and a lot of people don't realize, but the U.S. had over 400. Canada also hundreds, and Canada has done a lot of work in terms of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The government has openly called it genocide. They've given a tremendous amount of money and resources to, from everything from finding unmarked graves and excavation to living victims and trauma recovery and that whole range. But it's just very analogous, but a much larger scope. And I think the U.S. has started to do a little bit of work, but barely scratched the surface. And I think officially they say 50 of those schools had a burial ground, but I would be willing to bet that they all do, that they all had deaths, and there's a lot to be explained.
And of course, that sort of takes me back just to the title of your book, We Carry Their Bones. Maybe you could share with us a little bit about what that means to you.
Yeah, I think that, that title for me was, really, I think I would describe it as how I perceive the weight of the work that we do. Yes, as anthropologists, it's very literal, but it's more than that in the sense that, what always strikes me in this type of work is that families have so few places to go for help or answers, right? It's not like 1-800 cold case, and yet we have the power and the ability to do so much to help them. Science and technology is what it is today, that it's, DNA testing is possible, right? In 1940, those remains were lost in time and space. Even if they dug them up, right, they couldn't have figured out who they were. But today we can. And so I think that, it's that kind of, I don't know if it's a privilege or responsibility, but it's, the ability to help people who otherwise really have nowhere else to go.
Gosh, Erin, it's a fascinating, horrifying, and such an important story to tell. The work that you and your team did was so important, but then being able to translate that work into a narrative so that, the readers who are maybe less familiar with the techniques and the science, but obviously still familiar with their own humanity, are able to understand the weight of their bones. I think it's just a beautiful gift that you've offered, kind of in the way that you can to, maybe not undo this terrible, this wrong. Obviously, it doesn't right the wrong, but maybe to help bring some closure and some peace to the families and to the community. And so I thank you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And so, listen, at the end of the show, I always ask my guests the same 2 questions. And I'm curious if you're open for this very, very brief segment at the end where they're sort of big picture, kind of heavy questions. But I think we'd all be very curious to hear your perspective, given the work that you do and given, just who you are as a human being. So, I'm curious, when you think about the future, in whatever context feels relevant to you. This could be personal, professional. It could be familial, communal, national, global, cosmic. Number 1, what's keeping you up the most at night? What are you feeling maybe a bit pessimistic, a bit cynical about? How are you struggling? But then on the flip side of that, so we do end on a more hopeful or positive note. When you think about the future, where are you finding your optimism? What are you looking forward to?
Okay, that's good questions. Very good questions. I think that, I think speaking professionally, I guess, since, from where our conversation was, what I struggle with and get frustrated with, if you will, keeps me up. It's really this sort of politics of it. That it's always this struggle. I feel like to get people in this area to kind of do what they should, to do their jobs, to do the most that we can do, not the least that we have to do. And, in our cold case work and our historic justice cases and our, trying to get funding for programming, all of those things, it just feels like that's always kind of the challenge and the obstacle is why can we not say, hey, what is everything we can do to fix this instead of what's the least thing we can do? But I think that, for me, I think that the forensic art, it's not something we really talked about, but it's a part of what I do that I, really love and find a lot of peace in and enjoy. And so what we've tried to do is use forensic art and art exhibits as a way to share the work, share the information, engage the public, get families, in to give DNA, right, to do these DNA drives. And so found them to be pretty successful and well received. So I think that the more we can do like that, such as that, and maybe, even if it is with the, for example, the residential schools that we're talking about, things like that, is try to find these alternative ways to approach discussion about it in education that's maybe a little out of the box, but also opens it up to more people to think about.
Yeah. And not only does that approach help shed light on the history and like we mentioned, perhaps bring some peace or some comfort or at least some serenity to those who have suffered, but also I think it enlightens us to the future so that we don't continue to make the same mistakes. Because as much as we want to say that this is in the past, and as much as we want to say that, and yes, it's an extreme example, and yes, but like A, it's not isolated, and B, we are constantly recapitulating these themes.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And so thank you for raising our awareness of that and for sharing your insights there. Everybody, the book is We Carry Their Bones, The Search for Justice at the Dozier School for Boys by Dr. Erin Kimmerle. Erin, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed speaking with you.
As did I. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.